Now, in the previous video you watched that I created, we discussed the 5 characteristics that make up all cells, that all cells have in common. Now remember, there are 2 types of cells we're focusing on this semester: prokaryotic cells, which we'll cover in this segment, and eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are larger than prokaryotic cells. They have membranes and membrane-bound organelles. There is a cell membrane in both. But when I say they have a membrane, they have a nuclear envelope or a nuclear membrane. And this creates a barrier between the DNA and the rest of the cell. Prokaryotic cells will lack this barrier, as you'll see in a few minutes. And it's in part because they have much less DNA. Now, if you'll remember, prokaryotic cells, the word pro means before. So your prokaryotic cells are cells before there was a nucleus, or cells that lack a nucleus. And we're going to use just a basic shape here to get these started. And if you'll think back to what structures every cell must have, one of those is your cell membrane. And that's what we have here, a cell membrane. Now remember that a cell membrane provides protection for the cell by regulating what enters and leaves the cell. Within the cell, you have a supportive fluid, and this material is where many chemical reactions occur. It supports the organelles, and it is called the cytoplasm. So there's 2 of the 5 things that all cells must have, and I'm going through these first. The third things that all cells must have is genetic material. They must have DNA. Now, like eukaryotic cells, prokaryotic cells have DNA, but they have only a single chromosome or a single strand of DNA. This much smaller amount of DNA is not contained within another membrane, is not within a nucleus. It is found in the cytoplasm in a general region called the nucleoid. Now, this DNA is what is called naked because it lacks the associated proteins that large amounts of DNA in eukaryotic cells are wrapped around to keep them organized. It's not necessary in a prokaryotic cell because they're so much smaller. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, okay, you've covered the cell membrane, the cytoplasm, the DNA. I know what's next. It's the RNA. It is. RNA is present in prokaryotic cells. However, I'm not going to draw specific RNA molecules here. They're not one of the organelles I want us to focus on. They're not really an organelle. So, what we'll talk about instead is the last component that all cells have in common, and that is the ribosome. Now, when I say all cells have ribosomes, there is a difference between the ribosomes you'll find in a prokaryotic cell and the ribosomes you'll find in a eukaryotic cell. But the function is essentially the same. So you will have ribosomes. And don't worry, you'll hear more about their function in your video when you discuss the eukaryotic cell organelles, but just know for now they are also found in prokaryotic cells and they are necessary for producing proteins. Outside the cell membrane, prokaryotic cells have an additional barrier, and this additional barrier is called the cell wall, which is shown in red here. The cell wall adds structure and support and also helps protect the cell. You'll hear more specifics about cell walls later in the semester. For right now, just know that prokaryotic cells have them present, and their chemical composition can vary. Now, outside of the cell wall, some bacteria, and I stress the some, not all, have an additional layer of protection from the outside environment. And this additional barrier to the outside environment is called the capsule. And this is your capsule. It would be close against your cell wall. It would not be so far out. It's not quite so thick, but you get the general idea. Your capsule, maybe, if it is found, is the outermost layer. Innermost is your cell membrane, then your cell wall, then if it's present, a capsule, which is additional protection, as I mentioned, for the prokaryotic cells. If we're referring to a bacteria, this would be one that's more difficult to kill with certain antibiotics. Now, we have a lot of the basic structure done. There are some additional structures you need to be familiar with, however. There are some external structures that are actually anchored in the cell membrane. These structures are hair-like. As I mentioned, they come out of the cell membrane. And you'll see structures that resemble these again, but will serve a slightly different function when we get to our eukaryotic cells. In prokaryotic cells, these structures actually help the cell cling to its surroundings or adhere. Remember, adhesion is when two different molecules cling to one another, and when these help something adhere, they help it stick to something else. These hair-like structures are called pili, and they help the bacteria cling to surfaces. So if we're talking about a bacteria in your intestinal tract, this actually helps the bacteria cling to the walls of your intestines. It's a lovely little feature that bacteria have. These are not really used for movement. They are just used for adhesion. So then how do bacteria and archaea, how do they move around? Well, they have another structure that is anchored in the cell membrane, and this structure is called a flagella. And they may have one of these, they may have more than one, but these are the primary locomotion structure of a bacterium. So let me just spend a moment with you discussing this prokaryotic cell instead of wrapping things up. Your prokaryotic cell may have up to 3 structures which make up the outer layers. The one that it must have is the cell membrane. Outside of that, you will find a cell wall. Then there is a third structure which may or may not be present based on the type of prokaryotic cell you are dealing with. This is called the capsule. Again, the capsule may or may not be present. Ribosomes are always present in prokaryotic cells, just like every other cell, eukaryotic and prokaryotic. The pili are small hair-like structures which are anchored in the membrane, which allow the prokaryotic cell to adhere to surfaces. The flagella is used for movement. The cytoplasm is that jelly-like substance that supports the ribosomes and the DNA and anything else that is within this cell, and it provides a site for chemical reactions. The DNA is found within a region called the nucleoid. The DNA is naked DNA and does not have many, if any, associated proteins which help organize it because it is only a single circular strand of DNA. I want you all to focus on making sure you understand how prokaryotic cells differ from eukaryotic cells. We will spend a great deal more time towards the end of the semester on prokaryotic cells and about more of their functions, how they differ from one another, and the different types of organisms that are prokaryotic. So at this time, focus on understanding the parts of the prokaryotic cell in relation to how they can be compared to those of a eukaryotic cells. As always, please let me know if you have any questions.